The Power Paradox, How We Gain and Lose Influence by Dr. Keltner is a profound exploration of what power truly is, how it works in human relationships, and why those who seek or attain it are often at risk of losing it. Told through a mix of social psychology, personal anecdotes, and cultural analysis, Keltner's story is a deeply human tale about influence, not as domination, but as connection and contribution. At the heart of the book lies a contradiction: the very traits that help people rise to power, empathy, fairness, cooperation, are the ones that tend to erode once power is secured. Keltner begins with a dismantling of the traditional image of power as force or aggression. Drawing on decades of research, he shows that in both primates and humans, the most influential members of a group are often those who serve the group best. Power, in its healthiest form, is granted by others as a reward for being socially intelligent, generous, and trustworthy. The paradox, he explains, is that as people gain power, they often become less attuned to others. They listen less, empathize less, and begin to act with entitlement. This behavioral shift creates the conditions for power to decay. Through vivid storytelling, Keltner recounts how this pattern plays out in schools, workplaces, governments, and families. A teacher who starts out listening attentively to students may, after gaining authority, begin to dismiss dissenting voices. A rising executive might build her career by mentoring peers and collaborating across departments, only to begin hoarding credit and dismissing junior staff once she reaches the top. These aren't stories of villains, they're stories of ordinary people caught in a psychological feedback loop that isolates them from the social intelligence that once made them influential. Keltner backs his insights with rich scientific data. He describes experiments where those primed to feel powerful interrupted others more frequently, made more self-referential comments, and were less able to read facial expressions. The loss of empathy, he explains, is not a character flaw but a predictable cognitive shift. Our brains, wired for efficiency, become less sensitive to the needs and cues of others when we feel secure in our elevated status. This is the true danger of power, not that it corrupts in the moral sense, but that it distorts perception. To bring these abstract ideas into sharper focus, Keltner offers stories of powerful figures across domains. He examines leaders like Abraham Lincoln, whose presidency was defined by humility and moral clarity, and contrasts them with figures who became ensnared by ego or hubris. He even reflects on his own academic power and the need to stay vigilant against the subtle shifts in behavior that can emerge with authority. These self-aware interludes give the book a personal texture, reminding readers that the temptation of power is universal, not reserved for CEOs or politicians. The book also addresses how power dynamics shape culture. Keltner explores how institutional design can either check or reinforce power abuse. Hierarchies aren't inherently bad, he says, but they must be accountable. Schools, for example, can empower students and teachers through shared governance. Organizations that cultivate psychological safety tend to distribute influence more effectively, reducing the toxic effects of concentrated power. In these places, people don't have to pretend they have less power than they do, they learn how to use it wisely. One of Keltner's most compelling sections explores the body's response to power. He discusses how feelings of power can affect posture, hormone levels, and risk tolerance. These physical shifts often reinforce cognitive changes, creating a loop where power literally alters how a person feels in their skin. The embodiment of power, he argues, can lead people to act with confidence, but also recklessness. The story becomes not just psychological but biological, as Keltner shows how intertwined our minds and bodies are in the dance of influence. Keltner also challenges the notion that power must be seized or protected with aggression. He introduces the idea of power with, instead of power over, the idea that leadership rooted in service and mutual benefit is more sustainable than leadership built on fear or dominance. In this way, the book offers a radical rethinking of leadership itself. Rather than measuring power by control, we can measure it by the capacity to elevate others. This is not idealism, it's a strategic, evidence-based approach to lasting influence. The book then turns toward strategies for resisting the power paradox. Keltner encourages readers to develop self-awareness about how power affects them, to build feedback systems into their lives, and to prioritize emotional intelligence over hierarchy. He presents this not as a self-help checklist but as a cultural imperative. If institutions, communities, and families want to thrive, they must design power structures that reward prosocial behavior and punish exploitation. Keltner dives deeper into the consequences of power abuse, particularly the silencing of marginalized voices. When those in power fail to listen, trust fractures. The paradox tightens, leaders lose legitimacy, and their efforts become less effective. He shares stories from victims of power imbalances, employees silenced in meetings, children ignored in families, citizens excluded from policy decisions, and shows how easily influence can be lost when listening stops. These stories make the psychological theory deeply human. Yet the book is not despairing. Keltner writes with hope, believing that people can learn to wield power more wisely. He draws on studies showing that gratitude, compassion, and humility are not just traits but practices that can be cultivated. Power need not be the enemy of morality. In fact, he argues, the future depends on reconnecting power with ethical behavior. When leaders regularly reflect on their privilege and actively share influence, they not only remain grounded, they become more effective. The power paradox also touches on the cultural narratives that feed toxic power. In media, power is often portrayed as dominance, ruthlessness, and invulnerability. Keltner challenges these myths by showcasing alternative narratives where power flows from vulnerability, cooperation, and moral clarity. These counternarratives have the power to reshape what we expect from leaders, and what we expect from ourselves when we are in positions of influence. In closing, Keltner offers a final reflection on legacy. He urges readers to think about power not as a resource to be hoarded, but as a current that flows through relationships. Our greatest influence, he says, comes not from winning arguments or asserting control, but from empowering others to thrive. He frames the use of power as a moral art, one that requires reflection, discipline, and, most importantly, heart. The paradox never disappears, but we can navigate it more wisely. The power paradox is ultimately a story of hope, that by becoming more aware of the forces at play in our interactions, we can reclaim the original, humane purpose of power. Keltner gives us not just a new definition of influence, but a vision of leadership that is more democratic, more compassionate, and more deeply human. In a world increasingly shaped by hierarchies and polarization, this book reads like a roadmap back to connection.